With me today is David Tuerck, Professor and Chairman at the Department of Economics in Suffolk University. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So one of the issues that is, front and center of voters' minds these elections is the question of the economy and jobs. And Cahill and Baker both say that they're going to decrease taxes. If they were to be elected, how do you think these would affect us in the long run?
Well, I think reducing taxes would improve the economic condition of Massachusetts in the long run. It would, because we'd lose some revenue, it would cause some budget tightening, which I think would be a good thing because I think there's quite a bit of fat to squeeze out of the state and local budgets. But generally speaking, the lower taxes strengthen the state's competitiveness, and I think that they're on the right track by promising that they would in fact cut taxes.
Mm-hmm. So all the candidates seem to talk about the excessive spending on Beacon Hill. Is this true, and do you think that that's the place to cut, to make the cuts?
I think that we could cut spending substantially. I think we could cut $1 billion out of the budget and not notice much of any reduction in services. And there are a number of ways we could go about that, one of which would be to reform the pension system, to require state and local workers to contribute more to their pensions and to their health care, to get local workers into the group insurance commission rather than into other health plans that may be more expensive. We could do things like get rid of project labor agreements on public construction projects, which just drive up construction costs at the expense of the taxpayer. We could repeal the state prevailing wage law, which again drives up construction costs at the expense of the taxpayer. And indeed, I think that there's a good, strong argument to be made, especially in this economy, for cutting the compensation of state and local workers across the board. There'd be nothing wrong, in fact, everything good to say, except from the point of view of the workers, to cut their salaries, say, by 5%. That would save several $100 million, and it would be a timely thing to do, considering the economic conditions through which we're passing.
So it might, I mean, it might save the state money, but what about the livelihoods of these workers?
Well, their livelihoods would be a lot better than the livelihoods of the workers who are getting laid off because of the budget crunch. The problem is that the public employee unions would always rather see layoffs than take wage cuts. But layoffs are certainly not in the interests of the people, the teachers and the police that are getting laid off, and they're not in the interests of the Massachusetts taxpayers either. Modest cut in salary would be appropriate under these conditions. Certainly there have been salary cuts in the private sector, and I think that a step like that would be in the direction of shared sacrifice and highly defensible.
Okay. So another thing is that Baker is running ads that, claim that we will lose 21,000, or we lost 21,000 jobs in the last month. How truthful are these numbers and these statements?
I think that's the correct number. I think that there was, I didn't check the data myself, but I'm sure that Charlie Baker was able to look up the number and get that number right. It's in a way a distraction from the overall picture to be focusing on jobs in Massachusetts. I would fault all the candidates for making an issue of that. The candidates for governor and the existing governor have very little control over jobs in Massachusetts right now because the state is in the grips of a national economic downturn. So there's very little credit or blame to be passed around on that issue. So I think that's, in a way, a distraction from the more fundamental question of how the prospective governor would manage the state government.
Okay. So locally and nationally, all the candidates, whether gubernatorial for Congress, are talking about, creating jobs through, the green jobs. How do you think we can, the state can cash in on these green jobs?
Well, I think that this idea of creating green jobs is just nonsense. What it really means is that we're going to provide incentives to foster a particular kind of economic development over the economic development that would take place if the same money was available to private entrepreneurs. Most of these green jobs are jobs that have to have a state government behind them because they wouldn't be created otherwise, and the reason for that is because they are involved in producing products that people don't want to buy. I think that green job agenda is a completely contrived, artificial attempt on the part of state government, and not just here but elsewhere, to get into the business of picking winners and picking losers, and turning firms into losers that might otherwise have been able to expand if investment funds hadn't been diverted to them, to the so-called green jobs industry.
So how can jobs be created here in Massachusetts?
Well, Massachusetts has to wait for the federal government to get its policies right before it's going to see much improvement. But what Massachusetts can do on its own right now is to trim the fat out of the state budget, get taxes down as far as possible. One thing that it could do that would help a lot would be to trim the corporate tax rate, which is, I think, around 8% now, but still very high compared to other states. That's a real deterrent to job creation in Massachusetts, and that's one thing that the next governor should address right away, I think, in terms of making the state more competitive for economic development.
Okay, on another note, the unemployment rate has been steadily decreasing. You know, now it's at 8.4 from 8.8. Yeah. Is that a sign that the incumbent strategies have been working?
I think it's a sign that Massachusetts is a strong economy anyway. At my institute, the Beacon Hill Institute, we've been doing reports on the competitive advantage of Massachusetts, and we've always found that Massachusetts is either first or second. This is the first year out of 10 reports that it's slipped to third. Nevertheless, the Massachusetts economy is quite strong relative to the economies of other states. Mm-hmm. So it should be a surprise to no one to see that our unemployment rate is lower than it is nationally. That doesn't mean that we have to ignore the fact that our competitiveness has slipped a bit and that the state has economic problems, but I think that there are factors that make Massachusetts a strong economy mm-hmm. that have very little to do with who's in the governor's office at any particular time.
Mm-hmm. The Cape Wind issue has been really big on the news right now. How helpful will this project be in boosting our economy?
Well, it'll do our economy quite a bit of harm. It's going to add something like $3 billion to electricity rates over the life of the project. It will be a very, very expensive way of promoting renewable power, and the expense will come at the cost of ratepayers, who in many instances are businesses who already have high electricity rates and will be forced to cut back on operations or leave the state. So this Cape Wind project is a kind of anti-business development act for Massachusetts, and it's being fostered because a few people in power and a few developers have turned these windmills into sort of fetish symbols that they want to sprinkle around Nantucket Sound, again at the expense of Massachusetts electric power consumers and for very little improvement in the environment.
So as a final question, what are the challenges in terms of job creation and economic policies will the next governor face?
Well, the next governor is going to have to sweat out the rest of this recession, and we don't know how long that's going to take. I think that the governor will be under pressure to trim costs in state government. We'll have to do something about compensation. We'll have to bring salaries and benefits down. Going to have to get the unions to agree to terms that are more reasonable than the terms of which they are currently insisting. And they're going to have to figure out a way to live with less money by cutting tax rates.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us.